Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Seb Coulthard. I am a polar historian for Noble Caledonia, and I've been asked to just put together a little short talk on one of the stories of polar history, which you may come across if you're thinking of traveling to the Antarctic Peninsula, the Falkland Islands, or South Georgia. The story of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition led by the polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. It's one of those stories which I'm sure if you haven't read it, you're hopefully going to be intrigued enough by this expedition, by this presentation to pick up a book or watch a documentary, because it's really quite a remarkable tale of human endurance and survival, and it has inspired people across decades and decades and generation to generation. So without further ado, I'll get straight into it. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914-1917. It was led by Sir Ernest Shackleton. And who is he? He's from Anglo-Irish descent. He was born in Kilkere in County Kildare, Southern Ireland, around 1874. And at a very young age, he decided that he wanted to become a professional seaman and go to sea as a boy before the mast. And at the age of 16, his father helped him to get a job in the merchant fleet. He actually helped him in the hope that it would dissuade him from becoming a merchant seaman. He managed to get him a position as a boy sailor on board a tall ship sailing from England all the way around the bottom of Cape Horn, one of the most notorious pieces of water on the planet at the time, all the way up to Chile to pick up a cargo of saltpeter used in the production of explosives. So if you thought that would put him off, it actually didn't. It actually cemented his idea of becoming an explorer, becoming a professional seaman. And by the time he was 24 years old, he was successful in obtaining his Master Mariner's certificate, and he was given basically a license to become the captain of an ocean-going vessel. He was introduced eventually to Captain Scott around the turn of the century, around 1900, and this was having met his future wife, Emily Shackleton. And it was a very fortuitous meeting with Captain Scott, because he invited him to accompany him on the Discovery expedition, on which he attempted to reach the South Pole with Shackleton. This was Scott's first attempt to reach the South Pole. And you can see the picture at the bottom left there. He's pictured alongside another gentleman called Dr. Edward Wilson. And the three of them had a bit of a fallout on that expedition. They took a slight dislike to one another. Shackleton fell ill. He was blamed for, he was allegedly blamed for the failure of attempting to reach the pole. So he was invalided home. And just 5 years later, in 1907, he attempted his own independent expedition to reach the South Pole, the Nimrod expedition. It was known as the British Antarctic expedition back then, but the Nimrod expedition named after the ship. And unfortunately, during that expedition, he got to within 97 miles of the pole, and he was forced to plant the flag early after marching, about 700 nautical miles across the Antarctic. Very, very difficult conditions, using Manchurian ponies to pull the sleds. Unfortunately, one of those ponies fell down a crevasse, down a hole, and it just disappeared into a black void in the earth. And it took a sled full of food with it. And unfortunately, that food was enough to keep them going that extra 97 miles, but they lost it. And Shackleton didn't want to risk losing his men, so he turned around and went home. And he planted the flag, as you see there, planted the flag and returned home. And at the time, that was considered the equivalent of the Apollo 11 moon mission. It was like, it was the equivalent of an Edwardian era Apollo moon mission. So when they returned, they were like Argonauts. They were like astronauts. They were received as heroes. And Shackleton was knighted by King Edward VII. He was made Sir Ernest Shackleton, Knight Commander of the Victorian Order. And he wouldn't give up. He planned to return, but he it was a very difficult time to raise funds for expeditions, and in fact, it was Captain Scott who would return to plant the British flag, at the South Pole in 1912. But as illustrated down there in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that he arrives second. He arrives about a month after Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, had reached the South Pole. And unfortunately, that tale is one of woe and tragedy, in that Scott fails to return home. He perished along with his 4 companions, including Dr. Edward Wilson, who in fact died alongside him in a tent after suffering from scurvy and exposure, and eventually they went into a hypothermic sleep, and they didn't wake up, and they remain there to this day. Tragedy, beautifully tragic, and the writings of these men in their personal diaries, their last words are beautifully heroic and very stoic to the end, shall we say. So Shackleton thought, well, my career as a polar explorer may be over, and he began to think, I've got to do something else. So he planned the Endurance expedition, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. And an advert allegedly with this wording was circulated in the newspaper. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Well, I hate to tell you, if you've come across this advert before, yes, it certainly stirs the spirit, but it's actually apocryphal. It never took place. It was used many years later. It was written many years later in the, I believe it was in the 30s or 40s, to help kind of paint a picture of what that age was about. It was about men going on hazardous journeys. It was about small wages. It was about long months of complete darkness. But Shackleton certainly did not write that. And in fact, the plan for the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition was revealed in a letter to the Times newspaper on December 27th, 1913. So this was about a year after Scott's unfortunate end. And Shackleton basically says, I'm going to return, and this time I'm going to carry the British flag across the Antarctic. And that, at the time, was considered like going to Mars. They went to the pole. That was like going to the moon, but this was now something totally different. It was one of the most ambitious expedition plans ever presented to the various scientific bodies at the time, and the Royal Geographical Society. They just thought, it's impossible. How are you going to do this? So his plan was to take a ship, the Endurance, sail all the way from England to South America. And you can see the scale. There's England, there's the United Kingdom, there's a map of the United Kingdom in comparison to the Antarctic. The Antarctic is vast. It's 14 million square kilometers of ice. It grows to almost twice the size in winter when it's cold. In summer, it shrinks when the ice recedes. It's the coldest place on Earth. It's the driest place on Earth, believe it or not. The windiest place on Earth. To give you an idea, temperatures in midwinter, the coldest recorded temperatures there are in excess of minus 90 centigrade. So quite a challenge for 1914. But Shackleton nevertheless put together his plan, and that was to sail down to Varsel Bay and eventually build a little hut. The ship would leave, and then they would cross. So a team of 6 men, accompanied by 69 Canadian Huskies, would pull sleds all the way up to the South Pole. And I say up because the South Pole sits at 2,835 meters above sea level. And it's about 9,000 feet above sea level. So yeah, quite a challenge at minus 30 or 40 in the summer temperatures. And then once at the South Pole, having planted the flag again, they would proceed in the opposite direction towards the opposite side of the Antarctic. And the idea was that a second ship would come along, a ship called the Aurora, and they would deposit food across the Ross ice shelf from between McMurdo Sound and the Beardmore Glacier. And Shackleton ordered them to put the food at predetermined positions of latitude where they could pick up food on the way across. So that way they didn't have to take the whole lot all the way over. it would have just been too heavy. You're talking of several tons of food for 6 men and the dogs. So in fact, the dogs were actually part of the diet. That was the strategy that the Norwegians had used, and the food was of a very concentrated nutritionist value, so that they could get the most out of the proteins and the fats and the various goodies that were in there. And that was the plan. It was about 1,800 nautical miles on ski with dogs, and they also had some mechanical devices, some mechanical sort of tractors, like an embryonic style of skidoo, which they had tested only once before in Norway, and we had sort of mixed results. They had sleds with aeroplane propellers, which were going to push their stock of supplies, but again, these were tested very, very late in the game, and they were considered more of a sort of publicity stunt than actual working bits of machinery. But nevertheless, that was the plan. So the Endurance was planning to sail from London on the 1st of August of 1914. Shackleton went to meet the King at Buckingham Palace. He received that flag you see pictured there. That flag is now in the Royal Collection of Windsor Castle. And Shackleton and his officers welcomed their wives and sweethearts aboard the ship, just anchored on the Thames. They said their farewells. And it was, unfortunately, the moment when the first disaster struck the expedition, and that was war. War was declared. So you can see the picture, the date there is Saturday, August 1st, 1914. And yeah, things began to get very serious. So Shackleton recognized his position and his duty. So he contacted the British Admiralty. He offered the ship, the crew, and all of the supplies for a potential war effort. And the First Lord of the Admiralty, a gentleman called Winston Churchill, he, in discussion with the King, agreed that the expedition would proceed. And a single word telegram was sent to Shackleton once the ship had repositioned to Plymouth, and there they were ordered to carry on, perform your duty for king and country. This was an age when the British Empire, the sun didn't set on the British Empire, reigned supreme, and it was the day of the empire builders, and this was viewed as one of those empire building expeditions, and potentially great scientific discoveries would be made, adding to the prestige of the British Empire. So it wasn't something that was taken lightly to just, oh, right, let's abandon this. So they were ordered to carry on, and they did. And there was also this naive, perhaps you could say a naive belief at the time that, well, the British Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world at the time, would be able to keep the Germans at bay, and the war would be over by Christmas. So let's not make too much fuss about it. Let's just let the guys go, and they did. So they sailed down to South America, and on their way there, they stopped in Tenerife, where Captain Frank Worsley had a bit of a scuffle with a German warship. Even though, so war had just recently been declared. One of the first actions of the war, believe it or not, was Frank Worsley boarding a German warship which had come into the port and damaged the Endurance. And he went on board with a group of lads from the ship, and they took the German ship's carpenter by force and returned him to the Endurance to make repairs on the Endurance. And it's a little known story, but it's very much true. So in Tenerife, they sailed down to Buenos Aires, and there they picked up some additional members of the crew. And you can see Shackleton pictured there in the middle, he's in the blue ring, the blue circle in the middle. And they picked up Frank Worsley, Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer. Is absolutely one of the most legendary photographers of the day, and you'll see some of his work in a moment. And Charlie Green, the ship's cook, and William Bakewell. He's an American who, in order to get on board a British expedition, he needed the work, he needed the money. So he performed a little white lie. He said he was a loyal subject of the Empire, and that he was Canadian, when in fact he was actually from Michigan. And he helped this young lad you see pictured over here on the left. That is Percy Blackborough. So he actually became a stowaway. And Shackleton eventually discovered him aboard. they exchanged a few words, and he took a liking to him, and the ship was a man short. So he said, look, instead of throwing you overboard, I think you should come with us, because you're kind of a likable chap. And the cat, that's Mrs. Chippy, Mr. Chippy's pet, who was a pleasant companion on the little voyage. So that picture there is taken November 1914, when they were sailing down the Atlantic towards South Georgia. And at South Georgia, they took advice from the Norwegian whalers. He said, look, it's a really bad winter. You probably shouldn't go. But Shackleton was sort of committed. We have to go. We need to perform our duty. And some of the most remarkable photography from the heroic age comes out of this expedition. You see there Tom Crean cuddling some puppies, some Greenlandic huskies. We've got Hubert Hudson cuddling some emperor penguin chicks, and unfortunately in the bottom left we've got Charlie Green cooking an emperor penguin. I hope it's not the relative of those chicks. But some of these other photographs are quite remarkable. The photograph on the top right, that's actually 3 officers of the ship swabbing the decks of the ship, and that was unheard of at the time. Shackleton was amazing at breaking down social class barriers. He was an incredible leader of men, and that's what he's revered for today. For this model of leadership that inspires people to manage their resources in a better way, get the best out of people, and make them feel special and wanted and rewarded as well. So yeah, they performed. They played games on the ice. When the ship was stuck in the pack ice, they would, instead of sitting around smoking cigars and the sailors swabbing the decks, they would say, right, let's go have a game of footy on the ice. Off we go. And it's just a beautiful collection of photographs. This is one of the most remarkable images. It's the Endurance beset in ice. So the ship actually never reached the Antarctic. She was trapped in the Weddell Sea after sailing about 1,000 miles through pack ice. And unfortunately, this expedition never actually happened. They never crossed the Antarctic. They just simply couldn't reach land in order to build their hut, disembark their equipment, and head south. So instead, their transport became a floating winter hut. They turned down the boilers, they turned on the stoves in order to keep the spaces within the ship warm, and then they enjoyed each other's company. They listened to music, they had lantern slideshows, they had a sods opera on board. There are some really beautiful imagery that came out from this period. It was a sort of cross section of society at that time on a little ship, surrounded by the vastness of the emptiness of the Antarctic. Unfortunately, though, 10 months later, after spending a very long and very cold winter, the ship was heeled over onto its beam end, and the pressure of the ice surrounding the ship grew and grew and grew and intensified to the point where the ship can no longer withstand the pressure. And she was her stern was badly damaged, so the rudder and the propeller were torn away. The stern post, it's a very important structural part of the ship, was torn away, and water began to pour in. They realized they were going to have to abandon the ship. And amazingly, that process, rather than being sort of instant, rather than the ship sinking within a few hours or days, it actually was like a prolonged torture. It took about a month. And that is the Endurance, what's left of her anyway, just before she took her last slip beneath the ice, never to be seen again. You can see there Frank Wilde standing there looking over what's left of his ship, and I've always wondered what he's saying. He's sort of pondering, and I've always thought, gosh, he's just standing there going, damn it. Anyway, they managed to rescue quite a bit of food, the dogs, the lifeboats, tents, sleds, skis, everything they would need in order to survive on the ice for a prolonged period. And they built that encampment you see pictured at the bottom right there. That was called Ocean Camp, which is basically exactly what it is. It's a camp built on the frozen surface of an ocean that's about 3,000 meters deep at that point. So yeah, and they knew that the ice was drifting in the opposite direction. So they had sailed south, but that ice was actually drifting in a northerly direction, carrying them out to sea, back towards the Atlantic. So Shackleton, with that knowledge, decided, well, we're going to have to make our lifeboats stronger and slightly bigger. So he ordered the carpenter to modify them, make them a little higher. And then they tried to pull those boats towards land rather than just wait for months and months and months for that to happen. So that turned out to be a futile endeavor. It was more of a psychological game, really. It was really more to keep the men's minds busy. But physically, it was hugely demanding, and it nearly led to a mutiny amongst the men. And they decided, okay, we'll just build a second camp. It was called Patience Camp. And that was 21st of December, 1915. And they literally just sat there, and they were forced to eat through quite a few of their dried provisions. And unfortunately, those 69 Canadian Huskies became part of their menu. And that was always the intention at some point. But they had become more like pets by now, and it was almost tragic for that to happen. But nevertheless, it did. And about 5 months after that, by April 1915, so this is about 14 or 15 months after the ship had been stuck in ice, beset in ice, they simply stepped into the lifeboats. The ice began to break up, and they sailed north towards a very remote island called Elephant Island. It's literally the last island at the end of the Antarctic Peninsula. I'll show you a map shortly. And they had to sail amongst these incredible icebergs. Hurley couldn't take any more photographs. He didn't take his glass plate negative camera, a great big camera. He only had a pocket camera, and even in those conditions, he couldn't take photographs. So we're really reliant on the illustrations made by George Marston, the ship's artist. And this is one of those beautiful ones, the cathedrals of ice. And they continued to sail, eventually reaching Elephant Island about a week later. And it was an incredible feat of navigation to reach this island. They reached it by the skin of their teeth. Many of the men were in a very poor physical condition by this stage, almost to the point of collapse. And Shackleton realized that no one was going to come and look for them, so they had to go on a rescue mission of their own design. So Shackleton asked for volunteers, and all of the men put their hand up, but he selected 5: Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, John Vincent, Tim McCarthy, and Chippy McNeish. They would become the crew of the James Caird lifeboat. And on the 24th of April of 1916, they stepped aboard this tiny little boat. It's only 22 foot long. It has no keel. It was originally designed as a ship's lifeboat, not an ocean-going vessel. They packed it with 1,000 kilos of stone so that it would stay upright and be stable. They covered it in canvas. They put a load of food on board, and 6 men set sail towards South Georgia, where the expedition began, 800 nautical miles away. And they set sail with the hopes of 22 men who were left marooned, and with the promise that they may return. It must have been an incredible, difficult moment for all of them to say goodbye to Shackleton and his crew, but at the same time relieved, and possibly even feeling, wow, this is a step forward. With every step, we're improving our situation. And Shackleton always presented it in a positive light, just like that. So as you can see there, there's a map. The orange line, that's the ship's drift, right up to the point where it was crushed and sunk. And then the yellow line is the encampment, which drifted across the ice and eventually out into the open sea to Elephant Island. And then the blue line, that is the voyage of the James Caird. Again, it's one of the most incredible feats of human endeavor and seamanship and navigation, to take a 22-foot boat across the open Southern Ocean, almost at the end of the summer. You could say it was almost suicidal. At the same time, you could say it was remarkably brave. And they did it all using the equipment of the period. They didn't have GPS. They used, as you see there on the bottom left, they used compass, sextant, chronometer, paper charts, in a boat that was completely immersed in water all the time, using equipment and clothing that wasn't designed for use at sea. All this clothing was designed for the dry desert environment of the Antarctic. And the conditions inside the boat were horrendous, just cramped and dark, terrible, terrible conditions. And yet they did it. And they did it for their friends, they did it for each other. And it goes down in history as one of those great, great boat journeys. And they reached King Haakon Bay in South Georgia on the 10th of May 1916. And I'm not going to really give you a summary of the boat journey. I think for that you need to pick up the official account by Frank Worsley, Shackleton's Boat Journey. It's a beautiful piece of polar literature. I really recommend it if you're planning on going to the Antarctic, the Falklands, or South Georgia. You must pick up a copy of that book and have a read. It's very, very funny, and it's very, very detailed. It has all that beautiful Edwardian English in it. And you can imagine the arrival on the island. It must have been incredibly, it must have been an incredible relief for them to finally step foot onto solid land, only to then realize that actually they're on the wrong side of the island. Civilization was on the other side, 22 miles away. So they have to cross the interior of the island as well. 22 miles of crevasses, glaciers, jagged mountains. Nobody had ever crossed the interior of South Georgia before. Nobody had ever seen the interior of South Georgia before. And they were doing that using, again, the equipment of the period at the very end of their human endurance, at the very edge of survival. And incredibly, they managed to perform feats which no one has repeated since, using that type of equipment. And modern explorers have attempted to do this, myself included. It's incredibly challenging. And just to give you an idea, this is one of these remarkable locations, Fortuna Bay, and you can see there's Hebridean Sky, one of our sky ships, in the bay there, just opposite Whistle Cove. And it's named Whistle Cove because this is where Shackleton descended Breakwing Bridge after he heard the steam whistle from the whaling station on the other side of the mountains. And if you were to descend this ridge, and we do often land here to take guests from our ships to visit a penguin colony, a very large king penguin colony, and we can actually stand directly beneath this ridge. If you were to look up, it's almost sheer vertical. Worsley in his account said that if you were to hold on and look over your shoulder, you would just simply fall backwards off the ridge, and amazingly they survived. And you can absolutely believe it when you look up and go, my goodness, how did they do it? But this was what they were aiming for. Stromness Bay, Stromness whaling station, which was operated by Christian Salverson at the time. And again, there you see Het Sky. She's at anchor in the bay, and it is here that Shackleton knocked on the door 10 days later. After arriving on the island, he knocks on the door of the whale station manager's house, and he says, "My name is Shackleton. I have come across the sea and over the mountains, and I need your help." And the story goes that the whale station manager simply broke down and cried. He thought Shackleton had died a couple of years ago. And he asked him, any news on the war? When did it end? And he said, actually, well, the war has been going on for years. Millions of people have been killed. It was certainly that moment in history where things changed in polar history. This was considered the last great expedition of the heroic age, because the day of the polar hero was over. It was now the day of the war hero. Anyway, Shackleton pressed on. He honored his promise to rescue his men. There's a picture of the three of them, Worsley, Crean, and Shackleton, after they crossed the interior of South Georgia. They organized for a whale catcher to go around the other side of the island and pick up the other three lads who stayed with the James Caird, the lifeboat. And they recovered that, and they returned to the whale station, and then they sailed to the Falkland Islands, and there they managed to send a wireless message back to England to tell the world of what had happened of their expedition. And the telegram is remarkable. I mean, it simply says, Our ship was crushed. We drifted on the ice for months. We then took a 22-foot boat across the ocean with 5 men, and we survived, and we need urgent help. Um, and the world responded. But Britain, of course, was involved in the war, and it wasn't really a priority to go and rescue these men, especially since the Royal Navy was engaged in the submarine blockade, it was engaged in open sea battles in Jutland. So assistance came from the Chilean government after 3 other attempts to rescue Shackleton's men. It was the 4th attempt with help from the Chilean government, and that ship you see pictured there, that's the Yelko. It was commanded by Luis Pardo of the Chilean Navy, and it's thanks to him and Shackleton's efforts that they managed to return to Point Wild on Elephant Island, and they found all of their men, all of his men, still alive. He shouted from the front of the boat. You can see him there at the front of the boat. He's sort of clean-shaven, white face. He said, "Are you all well?" And they shouted back, "All well, boss. We are all well." And they returned to Punta Arenas, and from there they dispersed and went to the various corners of the Commonwealth and back to their homelands. And many of them joined the effort to fight in the war, and some of them, within weeks of returning home, had sadly died, and their names are now remembered on war memorials, and others are remembered in the written words of this expedition in the official accounts, which have this remarkable collection of photographs to illustrate them. But what about the other expeditions? If you recall at the beginning, I mentioned there were 2 ships, the Endurance and the Aurora. Well, the other expedition suffered equally, and it's often written out of this story. The Ross Sea Party, they had a tremendous expedition in which their ship broke away from the ice, it drifted out to sea. They ended up having to sail the ship with part of its crew back to New Zealand because part of the crew was left marooned on the Antarctic without adequate equipment, and they had to survive in the abandoned huts from previous expeditions. And eventually Shackleton returns to save them as well. And that is why this expedition, its official end date is actually the 10th of January 1917. And I often pick up history books where it says, oh, the Endurance expedition ended in 1916 when Shackleton returns to Punta Arenas. That's not entirely true. He would not leave any of his men behind. So he travels all the way to the other side of the Antarctic, to the New Zealand side of the Antarctic, and rescues the Ross Sea Party. He assists in the effort of rescuing them before he himself goes and serves in the Russian Arctic, alongside the British Expeditionary Force to assist the White Army against the Bolsheviks. And of course, that episode in history leads to the end of the Tsar, the assassination of the Tsar, and the establishment of Soviet power in all of Russia. So if you want to know more about Shackleton's remarkable story, the 2 books you see in the middle there, The Lost Men, that's the story, the harrowing saga of Shackleton's Ross Sea Party. It's worthy of its own presentation. Shackleton's Boat Journey, it's a beautifully written book about that small but humbling chapter of the Endurance expedition. And if you wish to know a little bit more about recreating the world's greatest journey of survival, it's an expedition I participated in 2013. There's that book there, Chasing Shackleton, where we reenacted Shackleton's boat journey for a 3-part documentary. And you can find more information about that online. And the largest relic of the expedition, the James Caird itself, still survives. It's at Dulwich College. It went back to Shackleton's school, and you can go and visit it by appointment once we're past these days of pandemic, and you can go and stand and connect physically with the history itself. So I look forward to meeting you at some point and seeing you in the future, and I wish you the best of luck and lots of health, and thank you very much.